Just so you know what my perspective is, most of the time I'm a partner in a law firm, and I do transactional work. Islamic finance is most of what I do for the last 21 years. At points it's been almost 100%. Now it's probably 50 because I do a lot of project and infrastructure finance work. Mostly my work is in the Middle East. So I live in Saudi for 4 years, in Dubai for 2. I'm in the Middle East probably 1 week out of every 5 for the last 20-some years. So the bias is more Middle Eastern. I work some in Malaysia, in Indonesia, but not as much as the Middle East. And of course in the United States. And I say the United States to you just because if you take Sukuk away, the United States is one of the largest Islamic finance jurisdictions in the world. There's a lot of Islamic finance in the US. A lot of the structures that are used around the world now were developed in 1990s and early 2000s in the US. That's because, not that they invented them, it's just the first time that the industry had to face quite sophisticated tax, bankruptcy, collateral security issues. And we'll talk about those a little bit as we go along. What I'm going to try and do, I should also mention, I teach Islamic finance for the last 15 years at the University of Pennsylvania, the law school, and the Wharton School. The Wharton School is a business school. It's affiliated or part of the University of Pennsylvania. So while my work is mostly transactional, the theoretical side is more with the teaching. Okay, what I hope to do here is just, and this won't be specifically Turkey focused, but give you some perspective of what we do when we go around the world trying to implement or reform, particularly legal and regulatory reform, but also some market reform, Islamic banking, Islamic finance in different countries. To me, Islamic finance is 4 different things. Banking is one part, finance is one part, investment, one part, and takaful is one part. So we'll focus mostly on banking here, but they overlap a lot. So you can't avoid looking at some of the finance and investment activity. I work a lot with the World Bank and other organizations in trying to look at legal and regulatory reform in different countries around the world. I think we've maybe done 30 countries or something in that neighborhood. So it's an international perspective. So some of the things that I'll mention you've already addressed in Turkey, in whole or in part, particularly on the tax side. The principles that we begin with, and you should tell me to get out of the way if I'm in front of the slides, are that we're trying to create a level playing field between interest-based financing and Islamic finance. So neither gets a benefit or a burden that the other does not have. We want to keep things level. So these efforts that I'll talk to you about are an effort to go into usually a predominantly interest-based system and make changes to allow Islamic finance in one of those 4 areas, or all if we can, work well. That often takes changing regulations, or at least interpretations of regulations, sometimes new laws, new regulations. In an average country, we look at maybe 150 laws of different types. We're doing some work in Turkey right now on the capital market side, and that's entailed thus far 70 laws, exactly 70 oddly. Okay, then the other consideration is, of course, you can't tax anybody in the Islamic finance side more or less than the people get taxed on the conventional or interest-based side. That's kind of a sub of the level playing field. Often the first big issues are tax issues. And of course, revenue authorities don't like to give up money very easily. So it's often the most difficult part of implementing Islamic finance. So you have to assure the country, the revenue authority, and that can be certainly the country, but states, provinces, all the subdivisions, that they will get no less money than they got with interest-based banking. Why do we refer to interest-based banking? Because it's predominant around the world, and most regulatory systems are built to interest-based system. So usually you're beginning there. Countries like Turkey that have begun implementing participation banking in some form, it's a little easier. You've got a head start. Taken years to get there, but you have that head start. So these are the topics that I'll kind of incorporate in my discussion today. These are among the topics that we cover in different countries. And these are the largest groupings of topics. Taxation, special purpose vehicles of different types, trusts, and of course, trusts, that's true even in jurisdictions like Turkey that are civil law jurisdictions. Even though the civil law doesn't recognize a trust, there are various aspects. Certainly you're going to have to be aware of it if you ever do international offerings or buy in the international markets. For example, most sukuk and most securitizations in the world are trust-based. Trust has been a very successful invention around the world. So even in France right now, there are bills pending to implement trusts under the civil law system, and possibly even to amend the civil law to do that. Some jurisdictions like Bahrain, that's a civil law jurisdiction, just went out and enacted a trust law, slotted it into the civil law, and said the civil law will have to take cognizance of it. And it's that important. So all the treasury financing and short-term treasury financing in Bahrain, they're salam structures that are issued through trusts. So that is a notable trend. Some things about asset-backed and asset-based considerations, which, along with trusts, kind of address beneficial interest concepts. The concept of property ownership, not being just the title, but an interest in the property, economic or otherwise. Collateral security, I won't deal with much because you have a very sound collateral security structure here. In the Middle East, it's quite different. Many jurisdictions, Saudi, you can't get a mortgage or a pledge, largely for political reasons through history. So you have to work an entirely different system. The point is only in many, many jurisdictions, the collateral security structures are terrible, not predictable. You don't know what kind of an interest you have. You don't know what your priorities are. And one of the biggest inhibiting factors for investment into the Middle East by hedge funds, investment funds, banks, is usually cited to be the absence of collateral security mechanisms that they can believe in, rely upon, and bankruptcy insolvency systems that they can rely upon. I have a number of hedge fund clients, for example, who are going to do distressed sukuk investing. And they did a survey of all of the bankruptcy, insolvency, and collateral security laws in all OIC jurisdictions, so 53, I think, whatever it is, and eventually decided not to proceed. They don't care if it's Sharia compliant or not. All they care about is the level of predictability. You know, they're just trying to assess risk and price risk. So Sharia compliant, they don't care. Not Sharia compliant, they don't care. They don't care if it's a good law or a bad law. They just want to be able to, what's the probability of something happening? How do I assess risk? And they decided it was just, at this time, too unpredictable for them to make large investments in those jurisdictions. It's not political, it's not religious, it's nothing like that. I will talk briefly about one or two issues in bankruptcy and insolvency. Bankruptcy, to me, by the way, is much more like iflas, the concept under the Sharia. Insolvency jurisdictions, and I'll pick on England a little bit here, insolvency jurisdictions tend to want to identify the creditors, the debtor, assemble the assets, sell them. Bankruptcy systems throughout the world tend to want to reorganize the business before you start selling assets. So give the business another chance. So in the United States, the law is called reorganization, Chapter 11. So you always begin with reorganization in a bankruptcy system. Insolvency technically is defined, as I'm sure you're aware, as either your inability to pay debts or assets less than liabilities. And then the system just tries to assemble the assets and liquidate and pay the creditors. So a very, very different approach. Some Sharia governance and some willingness of the government, a comment on the willingness of governments and other market players to want to do Islamic finance. Because oddly, that's probably the biggest impediment. I'll make a comment later, but municipalities have a lot of assets around the world. You know, the municipality of Istanbul has a lot of assets, and they're Sharia-compliant assets for the most part. It would be a great place to start developing, but there is no will, usually, I'm not commenting on them specifically, but usually there's no will at a municipality level to want to do it until somebody in the government tells you to do it. Same in the banking sector. For those of you who are bankers, I'll pick on you in a little bit. In many jurisdictions, and that's true here, there's no incentive to help develop the capital markets. You own the investment companies, you own the pension funds. Why? You want to create competitors. Well, there are lots of long-term reasons you might want to do that, but they're longer term. So you often get a lot of resistance from those market players. Okay, so this slide, and a lot of these slides I will just rip through, not say much about. You got to have some awareness of the structure, use of banking structures, Islamic banks. How many people are bankers? Okay, all participation banks or other banks? Okay. Okay, so you'll have a lot of awareness. So I'll pick one if we have time. I'll do it last because I'm sure you've addressed many of the issues. The structures that are used by banks, and they're the same structures that are used by conventional banks doing Islamic banking and finance. Not deposit side banking, but banking transactions, financing transactions through a bank. So take the United States or England before they had any banks, or Korea or Japan. There's a lot of Islamic finance in those jurisdictions, but it's done by conventional banks. And they use structures that are Sharia compliant, but none of them have laws allowing the formation of Islamic banks. In the United States, there is a committee at the Federal Reserve Board that's been studying the implementation of Islamic banking in the United States for 10 years. They're waiting for somebody to apply for a license. Well, if you want to do Islamic banking in the US, why would you ever do that? First of all, nobody gets a new bank license in the United States because it's just too difficult. You buy a bank somewhere else, usually a distressed bank, and restructure it because it already has all the licenses. But secondly, a number of people do Islamic banking, a number of banks do, but they're licensed as conventional banks. So we'll look at some structures like that. In this market, that could be done as well. There are lots of ways we've looked at with the Treasury to discuss that possibility. Okay. Different structures, Islamic banking, conventional. I don't like the word conventional, but it's convenient. Interest-based banking is what I mean by conventional. Same ends, you're trying to finance people. You're trying to earn returns on whatever financing you provide. One case it's interest, one case it's profit as a shorthand. So I'll kind of stick with that as I go through. I'm going to look at two examples, Murabaha, because you do a lot of them here, and the Ijara, because that's where you began. The system was built on leasing. If you look at the history of sukuk issuances around the world, historically, Ijara are the most common sukuk since 2002. There are blips since 2008. That's changed. Murabaha are actually, in 1 year, became the most frequently used structure, even though it's not tradable. Why was that? Because Saudi, United Arab Emirates, in particular Abu Dhabi, and Qatar wanted to finance infrastructure. And the easiest way they thought to do it was Murabaha sukuk. Why would anybody buy them? Because there's no trading of sukuk in the world. It's really minimal. There is some, but it's very, very minimal. So who buys a big international sukuk issuance? US and European pension funds and insurance companies. 40% of the issuances go to those entities. Prudential or CalPERS doesn't care whether it's Sharia compliant or not. What they're buying is a cash flow from a sovereign credit. What they're trying to do is match fund that instrument to their pension payment obligations or their insurance payment obligations. So their armies of actuarials have a good feel for what they're going to pay out for the next 20 years. And now they're trying to buy long-term financings to match. That's why they buy them. So those kinds of entities, Prudential, CalPERS, whoever, own a lot of sukuk. Perfectly happy with the investments. They're buying a government credit, Saudi credit, or Abu Dhabi credit. Again, they don't care whether it's Sharia compliant or not. Okay, leasing. Overwhelmingly around the world, leasing predominates in sophisticated transactions by a huge margin. Here in Turkey, instead of Murabaha going up, it went up a lot, as far as we can tell. Statistically, your use of Murabaha has increased a lot over the last 7 years, say. But you've started doing Wakala sukuk. That is kind of a global trend. It started in Malaysia. They still do quite a few Wakala sukuk. But it's a little controversial because of some of the compliance issues. It's tradable, though. So there's been a real trend toward trying to do that. We'll come back to these. So what's a Murabaha? I'm sure you all know, but first I want to begin with a conventional loan because I want to make a few points about taxation. Some of these things you fixed in Turkey, some you have not. So it's not a major issue. It's something you're, getting to as you go along. The big points have been made. When you do a loan, you have some stamp duty on the loan documents. You get repayments of interest. The bank is going to pay income tax on that return in whatever form. So I'm generalizing a little bit, and it's different from country to country, what the rates are and whatnot. But the concept, you pay income tax on the interest. And usually a bank doesn't pay any income tax on the principal that comes back, right? Important. I mean, it sounds so elementary, but it's really important. Because in Ijara structures, and often in Murabaha structures, if you don't amend the tax laws, you're going to end up paying income tax on the principal return. That's the most common big problem around the world. We'll go through that a little bit. So no tax, usually no VAT, no stamp duty, whatnot. So that's what we want to compare against as we go along here. Murabaha, sale at, purchase at a markup, has to meet all the sale requirements. And there's an interpositioning of a financial institution often, but it needn't be. There are lots of other people who provide Murabaha financings in different contexts, commodities, work, and whatnot. So the financier here is a bank. There's a seller of the asset, financed party, which would be the borrower, somebody needing money. And usually what happens is the financed party negotiates but does not sign the asset purchase agreement. Let's take true commodities. I don't like the, by the way, I really don't like the reference to commodity Murabaha. From the Prophet's time on, Murabaha transactions were commodity transactions. They're vector, the ones we should object to are vector, where the commodity doesn't matter. But if the commodity really matters, if you're bringing sesame seeds from Ethiopia, how do you suppose the big international trading companies stock the shelves of the grocery stores in the Middle East? Lots and lots of Murabaha transactions for beef, lamb, Argentinian beef, New Zealand lamb, from all over the world, vegetables, fruits. Many of those are true commodity transactions where the commodity matters. So to use the term commodity Murabaha as a disparaging comment for a platinum transaction in London or a palm oil transaction in Southeast Asia is really something we shouldn't be doing. Confuses the issue a lot. All right, this is a true Murabaha. Commodity matters. You care. The finance party will negotiate it, but they won't sign it. They then enter into a Murabaha agreement with the bank, simple enough, and the bank signs the purchase agreement instead, assuming it's Sharia compliant. But the pricing and everything is not negotiated by a bank. It's negotiated by the person who wants the commodity. Then the bank makes a spot payment usually. Doesn't have to be, it can be a financing. But usually it's a spot payment. Whoops. Takes title, sells the commodity to the finance party at a markup, and often that's a deferred payment. That needn't be true either. I mean, it can be a lump sum deferral, and you can structure it lots of different ways. Okay, that's what I'll begin with. So what happens here? Compare this to our loan. Well, that's the same. There's going to be a stamp duty on the purchase agreement. And you're going to get all these other taxes. You're going to, probably it's better to say that the Murabaha stamp duty, which I didn't show here, is the equivalent. Oh, I did. That's the equivalent to the loan. That's the only one that's the same as the loan transaction. So you have income tax on the repayment, which is the same. The bank would pay interest, income tax on its interest income. But what's the difference? There's a sale payment. The profit is in the payment. So is the principal. So now you're going to pay income tax on the principal. Not so good. You can't do Murabaha transactions in jurisdictions where that's done. You're out of business. Plus the VATs on the two sales. So there's a lot of extra tax in most jurisdictions. There's so much extra tax that the transactions aren't done until the laws are amended or you get a regulatory authorization. So the bank regulators in the United States and the tax regulators both took the position that this is a loan. They've both issued directives saying a Murabaha transaction for U.S. tax purposes is a loan. For U.S. bank regulatory purposes, it's a loan. Because in the U.S., they're not going to amend their laws specifically for Sharia compliance. They're going to amend the interpretation of the instrument in the transaction to say, we're not going to double tax people. And so what they do is they cut it down and they say, well, how much of that murabaha is profit? In other words, equivalent to interest. And they tax that. So we can do this either way in countries. By the way, if you have questions and things, just interrupt. Otherwise, I just go on and on and on, you know. It's, for days I can sit here and do this. Okay, so that's your simplest transaction that there is. The murabaha is usually said to be the most frequently used and the most frequently abused transaction in Islamic finance. And we'll get next to why. But this is not. This is a commodity where you care about the commodity. You're bringing lamb to Saudi, whatever. This is a vector, in my view of the world. This is what people usually refer to as a commodity murabaha. It may or may not be a tawaric transaction. It depends which version, which definition of tawaric you accept. There are three main ones. But same transaction as we did before, with the exception that after title comes to the financed party sells it immediately. So when you do in London on the metals exchange platinum transactions, this might take a half an hour. The only reason it takes a half an hour is they're doing so many of them. If it were just computer entries, it would take, 30 seconds to do all of that, because it's just banging it out. Why do you use platinum? In order to satisfy all the requirements of the bank taking spoilage, risk and ownership title and everything. Platinum sits in a vault in the basement of a bank. It doesn't spoil. It doesn't move around. It's easy. It's already insured, so you don't incur any other insurance costs. You have no transaction costs, or as minimal as you can get. There's a fee for running the transaction, but otherwise you can satisfy all of the Sharia requirements. What is it really? It's a loan. The bank gives out $100 million to the seller, and the finance party gets $100 million from a different metals purchaser. Usually those are affiliates. So it's one pocket to the other. Well, that's a loan. In substance, is this Sharia compliant? Of course, this is what we do most in Islamic finance. But why do the Sharia scholars not like it? Because it's a loan. The only reason you run this is to use the platinum or the metal as a vector to generate a debt. Okay? We don't have any substitutes. What's happened since 2008 is the increase in the use of murabaha is really dramatic. The use was going down and down and down around the world until the financial crisis. Then people didn't want to pay transaction costs anymore. So musharaka, mudaraba structures, ijara structures, salam structures all kind of got pushed out of the way. You can't push ijara out of the way in the international markets, but you can elsewhere. Then we developed all kinds of rules about doing sukuk. What percentage can be murabaha? Depends what Sharia scholar, 33, 51, there are different determinations. But the idea was we want to use more and more murabaha and sukuk, however you look at it. I personally don't think they're Sharia compliant. I'm not a Sharia scholar. But I love to argue about it and talk to Sharia scholars about it, that sort of thing. So it's good fun. But that's what happened. All right, what are the taxes here? Well, we've already seen there are 3 VATs. There were the 2 from our previous model. Now we got a third one. There are 3 stamp duty sets and possibly 3 income taxes. Yeah?
So where is this tax
It's here too. You have not fixed the stamp duty or the VAT issues. You've fixed the income tax issues in some situations. But you still have stamp duty on all the documentation.
We don't. No, we don't.
Some, well, it depends. Some you do. I can get the lawyers here from Paxoy. I don't know your system well, but one of the people on our team, we're making charts of what exactly gets taxed. And at least I'm told by the Paxoy lawyers, tax lawyers, they haven't fixed them all. I can't argue the case. But you're making a good start. The 2016 law was really very helpful. But at least those lawyers don't think you fixed everything. So I don't know. I mean, you can talk to your local lawyers about it. I don't know the answers specifically.
I mean, in the Rama structure, we don't have evaluated taxes as you specified in the previous slide.
Well, you may not be paying them, and you may not think they're due, but there's some debate, let me put it that way, about whether the government has the right to tax you on these. I don't know.
There is one VAT tax. When you buy something, you pay. But when you sell it,
You don't pay.
you don't pay.
And what
You
happens?
have to pay.
What happens if you do metals transactions in London?
Metals transaction.
Because a lot of your banks do, right?
There is no VAT tax there.
In London transactions?
No. LME transaction, you mean metal exchange
Yeah.
transaction. As far as I know, there is no VAT tax. No, it's tax exempt. Otherwise, it would be very costly.
Yeah, no, that's
know.
the problem in many jurisdictions,
Yeah, right.
is this. As I said, I don't know exactly what you've fixed here. It sounds like, I do know that people were really happy with the lawyer and community around the world was really pleased with the 2016 Act. So I don't know exactly. That's why I told you at the beginning, I'm trying to tell you about international practice because this is the most common problem around the world. Now, in 2016, it seems you've addressed some of, that's why I said some, because I don't know exactly in Turkey what got fixed and what didn't. In another month and a half, I'll know exactly. Because that's what, among the 70 laws are those laws, and we're going through precisely because they want to fix it here. This is a jurisdiction where you have a lot of cooperation at the government level relative to the rest of the world. Okay, Ijara transactions. Same thing, just to remind you of the loan. Whoops. Thank you. All right, so most jurisdictions in one form or another, this is a conceptual ijara, in most jurisdictions in one form or another, and we've done them in, I think, 38 countries. They change a little, the structure, depending. Like some countries tax anything that has the economic substance of a put option or a call option as a transfer on that day you sign the option. They don't wait for you to transfer. They assume the option is exercised. So if you give both a put and a call on real estate, you buy a piece of real estate and you give a put and a call, which we do in every Sharia-compliant lease transaction. You give an understanding to purchase and an understanding to sell, however you call it, you get taxed 3 times on transfer tax. Some jurisdictions have actual real estate transfer or other asset transfer taxes. Some have VAT. Some have sales tax. It depends where you are. But you're always going to get taxed 3 times in that. Sweden is one of those jurisdictions, for example. So when we did it, the first Sharia-compliant deals in Sweden, we had to spend a lot of time adjusting the structure you're about to see. Germany is different because it's a usufruct, much stricter usufruct jurisdiction than here, their interpretation of the civil law. France is a credit by immobilier structure. Interesting historical fact, when we did the first one, after World War II, that structure was developed. And the guy who developed it was Muslim. So the Ijar, the lease structure, the Credit by Immobilier, is Sharia compliant since inception, just because he was aware of it. It's hard for me to stay still, though. Okay. So, I'm going to show you kind of a summary slide. This is the tax interpretation in many jurisdictions. Leave Turkey aside for the minute. But in much of the world, this is the interpretation that the taxing authority takes to equalize the taxation on Sharia-compliant Ijara transactions. And I'll show you in more detail in a minute. But as you go through, bear in mind that what they say is this is really a loan in economic substance from the bank to the customer, and the rent payments, purchase payments coming back the other way are interest and principal combined into a payment. And then they tease out what part is profit or interest and what part is return of principal, because they don't want to tax you on the return of principal. It takes a while to get a taxing authority to do this. I spent a year in Tanzania with the taxing authorities working to this conclusion. And then when we got there, of course, the government changed and we started all over. Not to be cynical about it, but. So they look at it from an economic substance point of view. The interpretations will vary a great deal from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending upon how your taxing authority and others, bankruptcy, collateral security, et cetera, but begin with tax. Are they substance over form? Do they say, I don't care what the form is, I'm going to look at the economic substance? Or are they form over substance? Most civil law jurisdictions care more about form at the beginning. Well, that's a field day for a lawyer in a sense. If I can find a form that works, then the economic substance doesn't matter. It's more difficult in a jurisdiction that begins with economic substance. You can't talk them out of that, no matter what form you use. So they're going to tax you then. So, simple lease. This is what we'll get to eventually. Usually you see a diagram with one lease. That's almost never done. I don't know here in Turkey, but I'll know by this afternoon. But overwhelmingly around the world, you have four main documents for the financing: the lease, and the rent payment under the lease is the equivalent of the debt service in a loan, principal and interest. If there's amortization, if you had a bullet financing, a 5-year bullet, so all the principal was due at end of year 5, nothing before that, then you would have no principal until the last payment on the rent. It would all be interest equivalent. The understanding to purchase and understanding to sell, does everybody know why they're there? Otherwise, I'll spend 1 minute on it. If you want to just, I'll leave the slides and you can take them. Well, there's a Sharia principle, for example, that you can't accelerate future rents, right? Usufruct is a lease is a purchase of usufruct. And you purchase it period by period. So if you had a 1-year lease, you purchase for 1 year. When you get into variable rate leasing, let's say you use six-month LIBOR as your reference rate, you're going to have leases for 6 months. Let's take the 5-year bullet. It's interest only or profit only. So the rent payment is only profit for 4.5 years. And the 5th year, the last payment, is all of the principal, 100 million TL plus whatever profit for that one period, for 6 months. Okay, if there's a default in year 2, in most jurisdictions you have to terminate a lease, and under the Sharia you have to terminate a lease, often to kick somebody out. So a bank accelerates a loan, just gives an acceleration notice, and the principal's due. You can't do that under the Sharia because you can't accelerate rents. You'd have to wait to the end of year 5. In fact, one of the provisions of the new Saudi mortgage law, I've worked on that law for 19 years, is that they're going to take the money, if they terminate some leases, put it in a bank account and pay it out on the same schedule despite the termination. So you're going to introduce another credit risk and the money's going to sit there. So you terminate in year 5, they'll kind of take all the rent, which the reason I'm confounded by this is because that's accelerating rent to me if you get in the cash. They're going to put it in a bank account and then pay it out over the next 3 years. Okay, so how do you get how does an Islamic bank collect its money? The understanding to purchase, which is economically a put option. It's a sale of whatever asset it is. Let's say it's a commercial office building. It's a sale of the commercial office building to the customer on that day. What's the strike price or the purchase price? It's the outstanding principal. So you can't collect your money, future rent, and thus your principal under the lease. The understanding there to purchase is there to allow you to collect your principal under a different Sharia-compliant document. The understanding to sell is a call option. It's economically, it's not, of course, under the Sharia. But if the customer wants to sell the building, they call the property. What's the strike price or the purchase price under the Sharia? Outstanding principal. That's how the bank gets its principal back. So, and the managing contractor agreement is to handle some Sharia rules. Much of the world is triple net leasing, meaning the customer pays taxes, insurance, and all other expenses. Under the Sharia, you can't pass structural maintenance and correlatives, like casualty insurance, can't pass those costs in a lease to the lessee. But you can use another nominate contract, managing contractor agreement, to hire the customer to do that work and thus pass the risks to them for a fee. Well, what happens in reality? The rent goes up by the amount of the fee. So it's a net zero. Now that gets you to triple net leasing, which is the lease financing mode used in all the world, aircraft, power plants, what have you. So if Islamic finance, in order to compete, has to use more documents, more stamp duty, sometimes more VAT, because you're going to transfer that asset more than once. You're going to lease it once, and at least once more, you're going to sell it, which means income tax, transfer taxes, however you call them, VAT, whatever it is. All right. The problem with this in most jurisdictions is that the rent under a lease, which is both principal and interest, either amortized regularly across, on a 30-year amortization schedule or whatever you're using, or in a bullet, the last big payment, which means that the rent includes the principal. And if there's going to be an income tax, this has been fixed, I know, in Turkey, but there'd be an income tax on the principal. Well, that doesn't help Islamic banking at all, obviously. Yeah.
Income tax on the principal.
Yeah.
But it is not income,
Rent is income under most systems, overwhelmingly. It is not here. You've tried to fix this. But in most countries, if I'm a business and I'm in the business of leasing something, I lease it to you, the rent you pay to me is taxable income. That's the problem. It gets worse because this is a very simple structure. You get to use this sometimes with your ALCs and your participation banks. I think you can lease directly, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, so you've fixed it in different ways, some of it here. But most of the world isn't like this. Okay, so they're called purchase agreements, but in economic substance, think of them as puts and calls on property or planes or whatever the asset is. Yeah? You're okay. Somehow the customer is going to ultimately own the asset. It's a loan if you use a comparative financing analysis. So there's going to be at least one transfer of title. Now, it may be in Turkey that you don't transfer. There be a seller out here. If somebody were buying a property, wanted to buy a property, would the bank then buy it? You could do a murabaha and sell it at cost plus, or you could lease it, and at the end of the lease, a wa'ektana arrangement, the customer would become an owner. So in some countries, that's two sales. Not so good. People think of stamp tax as kind of a small amount. Okay, it's probably not great. Some countries it is quite large. We just paid something like a $20,000 US stamp tax in Dubai on a piece of property. You know, that's a fair amount of money. When you start thinking about sukuk, and you're going to put more than one property in there, say 50 properties, like the Tamwheel sukuk, I don't know if you're familiar with it, was a sukuk that took ijara transactions of houses on the Palm, the Greens, different areas in Dubai, and packaged them. I was living in Dubai at the time, and I was living in one of the houses that went into the securitization, which was a really interesting thing to have happen. Okay, so you have asset, you got VAT on at least that. Well, that's fine. You might have it on a loan. You fix that easily enough if there's the will to fix it. Some countries, by the way, the response usually is, it's too difficult for me to distinguish between what's Sharia compliant and what's not, so I'm going to leave the VAT. Because they're afraid that people will start taking conventional transactions, characterizing them as Sharia compliant to avoid the VAT. Is that likely? I don't know. I'm not, I don't know how people react in the world, but that clearly is the Revenue Department's view. We've had that problem a lot in Africa. They just won't move off the point. I don't think it's that hard to distinguish myself, but they do. Okay, so what are the cash flows here? Simple transaction. Purchase price, the asset goes to the bank. The customer pays rent. Now, you may have fixed this in Turkey, but most of the world, I say, has not. So there's income tax on the principal. And that's true on every rent payment. At the end of the transaction, usually the asset is transferred to the customer. Well, does that get taxed? Probably, most jurisdictions. Maybe not here, I don't know. Yeah. Well, you're ahead on these points, and 2016 was a real help. But the rest of the world is not where you are. These are areas where you have a real advantage. Where you don't have such a good advantage is when you try and securitize these. You do a sukuk or a securitization, and that's too bad. I mean, one of the reasons we're all here is to try and figure out how to fix that problem. We gave our first, this is the second part of our mission, if you will. The first was, a year ago, and was to help with that 2016 Tax Act. What should you fix? Now we're focusing more on, okay, this is good. Now how do we help you securitize it? how does a municipality raise cash? How do you raise cash for your project and infrastructure financing? Those are the bigger issues that they have us focusing on now. Okay. Anyway, the point is already made. You shouldn't be taxing all that rent, only the component that's interest. Now, this is the more common structure around the world. You could do this. We've checked, as far as we've gone in checking, you could do this. Conventional banks in Turkey could use this. All of the Ijara financings in the United States are done this way. All of them in England, most of Europe, Portugal, Spain, Luxembourg, the ones I know of, because I've done those. But it's called a bifurcated structure because part of it is Sharia compliant and part is not. Why is that developed? To allow Islamic finance in jurisdictions that are interest-based finance jurisdictions and don't have any Islamic banks, which is most of the world. So we wanted to do deals in the US. And we've done, I think I have done just over 600 of these transactions in the US alone since 2000, the year 2000. So quite a few every year. Like I'm doing 9 of them this week. It's very common in the US. Middle Easterners are buying office buildings. They buy, how are private equity deals done? Our capita, many of you will know. How did they do their private equity deals in the US and Europe? Ijara transactions, exactly the same structures. Some reversals of asset movement and payments, but same. Okay, so it's an important structure to know of. The international sukuk markets, that Tamwil sukuk in Dubai was exactly this structure. So a bank's going to make a conventional loan to a funding company. The funding company is an SPV. Well, there's a problem in Turkey. That's one that we haven't been able to fix as yet. You should be able to form an SPV in an afternoon. If you come to me in the US, I can form you a Delaware corporation in a matter of 2 hours, 3 hours. Very similar in many developed countries, not all. But it's that easy. It should be that easy. It costs nothing to form a company. A couple $100. You can't do that, and most of the world can't do that. And it's a big debate because, of course, governments want to watch every little company. Well, they're all filing anyway. You have tabs on them from the moment they're formed because they're formed by a filing with a government. So if you have the information system, it's not hard to track them for their duration. It's not difficult. But governments don't like to give up the power to track and to control formation. But this is one of the biggest problems. Why do you use SPVs? You want to control the liability to just that entity. You want to put one asset in that entity and have no other creditors if you're a banker. Rating agencies, what's the first 2 things they look at? SPVs and bankruptcy, insolvency. And then the collateral security structure. But they begin here. It's in the top 3 for everything. It can't do any other business except the one thing that you're focusing on for the financing. So it's not going to go into bankruptcy unless you as a banker put them into bankruptcy. There's nobody else to put them into bankruptcy. There are no other creditors. So the reception from US banks, English banks, Japanese banks has been really great. They look at these structures and say, wow, this is really well protected. I don't have to compete against anybody. The customer is often a company, not just a customer. That's also an SPV. So in most of the transactions you see in Islamic finance globally, you have at least 2 SPVs in the baseline structure, and you never put more than one asset in one structure like this. Otherwise, you have creditors and income and problems from different pieces of property or planes or whatever it is crossing each other into one entity. So you do this, if you do a fund, you know, we might have, the fund might have 800 funding companies and 800 customers, project companies. Can you do that here? No. That I'm pretty clear on. Talking to the people in the government about it. Well, that's a real impediment globally. It would help your market a lot. It would be an adjustment. Anyway, the title is, there's going to be a conventional loan, and that company is going to buy it and put title in there. Now that raises an issue that is quite different under the civil law and the common law jurisdictions. Because who do you want to be the real owner? You want this side to be the real owner, the Sharia compliant side. If there are tax benefits, depreciation, investment tax credits, that kind of stuff, you want it to go over here. You don't want it wasted over on this side. So in the common law jurisdictions, what do? What is it, mashwak? What is a bundle of sticks for? Miswak. Ownership in common law is like the miswak bundle. You take one out, you still own it? Probably. If you take 10 out, do you still own it? Getting a little harder to determine. Depends what the 10 are. Ownership is a bundle of sticks. It's a collection of attributes. The civil law is very, very different. You got one stick. That's changing. France is considering quite a number of laws right now to incorporate beneficial ownership concepts into the civil law. It's proven very helpful. So what do? We take one stick, title, and we put the title in the funding company, and we keep all the other sticks for the project company, the customer. So for tax, for all other purposes, the customer is the owner. For mortgage purposes, the mortgage laws, recordation laws and things, the customer is the owner. The funding company is the owner. You have to be able to do SPVs, and you have to be able to think of beneficial interest concepts in order to do this really effectively. So when you go jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that's another thing you think about and analyze under the laws of a country. Okay, can these structures work? If not, what do you need to do? Okay. Usually the funding company in these transactions is not owned by anybody in the deal. You can't lease to yourself under the Sharia. In most countries, you can't lease to yourself under the law of the country. It collapses the lease. So you need somebody else to own the funding company and hold the title, but you don't want them to do anything. You don't want them to be able to make any decisions or determinations because all of the economic interest, the real ownership is over in the customer, the project company. So a friend of mine in the US, we convinced in the late 1990s to own the funding company for our Sharia compliant deals. So he holds companies that hold title. And he charges us a small fee for that. You know how many of them he has through our Sharia compliant transactions since 1999? We did the first one in 2000. We structured it with him in 99. Take a wild guess. 40,000. He gets paid $3,000 per company per year. He retired. He just owns these for us. And he owns them all over the world. Really interesting. Very small fee in our transactions. I'm talking, these are all commercial transactions, so the smallest one's probably 30 million. The largest one in US dollars. The largest ones are 400 million, that range. And he gets $3,000 for each one. Anyway, then we can lease. Okay, the tenants in a building, let's say it's a commercial office building. It's easier, it's a good example, but it could be an airplane. We do medical equipment, you know, x-ray machines, whatever. You do anything with this kind of structure, any asset. In reality, I showed you before, it's going to look like this. It's not just a lease, because you need that understanding to purchase to make sure the bank gets paid. You need the understanding to sell so that the customer can sell the asset whenever they want and make a profit. You need the managing contractor to make sure my friend doesn't do anything. Just give him money, $3,000, and let him be done. He files our tax returns on the funding company as well in the US. But the US is different. In no other countries like this in the world on one point. And it's why I think the easiest place in the world to do a Sharia compliant deal is the US. But this funding company, we have some tax regulations which are called the check the box regulations. That's how everybody refers to them. They are regulations that were put in place to encourage business development, structural development. On your tax return, you can check a box, and this entity is not taxed. It's called a disregarded entity. The Internal Revenue Service pays no attention to it. Now, somebody has to pay the tax, of course. Well, the customer, because they have all the economic benefits, pays the tax. In every other country, the rent gets taxed. England, the rent gets taxed when it comes in here, and then there's another tax when it goes up to the bank. So principal and interest are getting taxed there. Interest gets taxed again up here. Principal doesn't get taxed up here, but there are two taxes on interest and one on principal. And you remember some years ago, 6 years ago, England went through amending their tax laws. It was to fix that problem. They didn't adopt a check the box. They just said in a Sharia compliant deal, you don't tax the principal over here. We'll look at that again in a second. Okay. Whoops. SPVs, I've talked about some, so we won't go through that again. You can imagine when you build a sukuk, what you're thinking of mostly in Turkey at present is sukuk offerings with one asset, or a very small number of assets. In the US transactions, I want sukuk with 1,000 assets in it. I want to do credit card receivables. I want to do royalty payments from oil and gas, and we've done some of these. Well, then you got lots of leases, 1,000 of them, going into the transaction. So when we talk about the taxation, it can be really big amounts if it's not, if it's not exempted, either by changing the law or the interpretation or however you're going to do it in your country. Okay, SPVs. You want somebody to hold the asset? You only want one asset in each SPV? You know, it only costs like $100 a year to have a company in the US. So how many do we form? We don't care. It's not a cost factor. A few $100s to form it, and then you got some fees that you pay annually, but the fees are nothing. The state of Delaware, as you may know if you ever watch the news, every company in the United States is a Delaware corporation, right? Every big corporation, certainly. There's no tax. All these things, and their fees are minimal. They do these by the tens of thousands. So it's a volume business for them, for the state. And that's always been true in Delaware. What's happened in Delaware since, of course, is because every company is there, that's the best corporate law in the country. They have to face every difficult issue. Their courts have had more experience with entity, partnership, corporations, LLCs, disputes, issues, so they're really sophisticated at it. So now you want to go there not because of the money, but because you're going to get a result that you can predict, and it makes sense. That's why you go to New York in the United States for finance. So the companies get formed in Delaware, and they all the financing agreements are New York law, specifically New York City, because the courts there have seen these structures and every imaginable structure. Jurisdiction shopping, you know, that's what lawyers do. Bankruptcy, to limit the credit exposures so they don't have any other business. You want your commercial office building to do only one thing: rent the space in the building, not go into any other businesses. Bankruptcy, the only person that can put them in bankruptcy is you as a bank. There are no other creditors of any size. I mean, there might be cleaning people that clean the building. You may have to buy some supplies, but those get paid in cash flows immediately. Bankruptcy remoteness. I'm in charge of a couple projects, one for UNCITRAL, one for the World Bank, one for the IFC, one for EBRD, all focusing on the same thing. They all have model secured transactions laws, mortgages and pledges, security interests. What we're trying to do is make those model laws Sharia compliant. And it's not the easiest thing to do. We've been working on it a little while. Next week in Cyprus, actually, we're having a huge meeting on looking at the next set of changes. But we're progressing. The problem is, first, countries don't have good collateral security or bankruptcy laws. And secondly, they're usually not Sharia compliant. So you have a lot of unpredictability in how a Sharia compliant deal gets interpreted in a court and how it gets enforced. Not such a big problem here, although every lawyer I've talked to here has said they don't really know, because you haven't had a lot of them go to court. They all say it shouldn't be a problem. Well, but they won't sign opinions saying it's going to come out one way. You know, I have a lot of fun teasing them. Okay, do you give your banks an opinion that that's going to be the result? None of you have ever gotten one of those opinions. Okay, sukuk. All right, so what goes on here? You're going to have a lot of VAT because you're going to transfer the asset. It's got to get back to the customer. Do you have that here? I don't know. I don't think so. I haven't read the 2000. Somebody's got to translate it for me is the problem. So translation comes last, unfortunately. But somehow one of those is going to get exercised. Well, you don't have that in a loan. And I think you've fixed it where a participation bank does a lease and the asset goes to the customer at the end. Is that true? Or do you? Don't know. Haven't gotten that far. Well, who knows? It's an issue anyway. You're going to have some different structures depending upon whether that's a loan, interest-bearing loan, or a Sharia-compliant arrangement. You can do either one in that sector. By the way, when you convert this to a sukuk, what are you going to do? You're just going to get rid of the bank and put an SPV or a trust in its place. Otherwise, nothing changes. These structures don't change at all when you load them into a securitization. And a sukuk is a securitization. Okay, so what happens? The customer puts in a down payment, the bank provides some financing, that's 100% of the purchase price, and the title goes to the funding company. I should have put an arrow. The funding company owns the asset, it turns around and it leases it to the customer. Right? How do you pay it off? Well, the tenants in the building pay rent. You fund your reserves, your tax reserves, your insurance reserves, maintenance reserves, you know, capital improvement reserves, whatever you're funding. And what's ever left, well, first you pay the bank rent. And I'm wearing it out, but depends on the jurisdiction. That might include a tax on principal. There may be a corporate tax here if this is a jurisdiction where that's treated as a corporation that pays tax. At any rate, in most, what you're trying to do is make that rent payment exactly equal to that. Exactly, to the fraction of a cent. Can't do it if there's any taxation in this stream. You got to put more money in to pay the tax. So you're going to have tax leakage. Now, most of the time, say in Europe, most of Europe, we can fix that because we'll create some expenses here and pay the expenses to an offshore tax-free jurisdiction. That's what tax lawyers do. And then if we get enough deductions, this will become a net zero for tax. And those are legitimate deductions. Somebody has to give advice for these transactions. You can pay consulting fees. You know, you can do it different ways. But societally, who's the only person who makes any money on that? Lawyers. It's great for sending my kid to school, but it's societally a waste of money. So every jurisdiction should fix it, because we're going to get it fixed one way or another. Okay, whatever's left over after all those things goes out to the investors. All right, so is that a taxable entity? We'll quickly go through, mentioned it, but in analyzing this, you got to ask, where's every tax? Is that going to be a purchase and sale? Is it income tax? When a customer gets their property back, is that taxable income? You can say no at the beginning because maybe the rent was enough to, you know, absorb some of that. I see you every day. Yeah. Well, it depends. What if the property went up in value? Between the time the funding company or the bank got it, most jurisdictions will say that appreciation in value is taxable to that person. That shouldn't be true. This was just a financing. Then, of course, there's, you know, we did the strike price. And if the strike price is paid in full, who gets the customer, the project company, or in a home financing, the person buying a home gets the asset. Now, I should mention this, I guess, from a Sharia perspective. This and the understanding to sell, the put and the call economically, can be for the whole amount or only part of the principal. So I'll give you an example from a more sophisticated transaction. Either in a real estate or a project and infrastructure transaction, you're going to have debt service coverage ratios or rent coverage ratios. And let's say the property drops in value, then you have to prepay part of the principal to bring the coverage ratio down into sync. So you exercise the understanding to purchase for the difference, for that amount that's necessary to be paid to put the coverage ratio back in the correct spot. On the call option side, the understanding to sell. If I'm building a condominium, high-rise condominium, how does that market work? Well, let's say it has 100 units. I want to sell 10. So I'm going to start selling them before I go into the ground, or as soon thereafter as my Sharia board will let me. As soon as I dig the hole, I'm going to start selling the condos. I want to sell 10. Most of the world, and I don't know what it is here or the equivalent, most of the world, the bank would say, you got to pay me all the proceeds from all 10, the first 10. So 100% of the proceeds from that sale go to prepay the bank. Whether it's a conventional loan or Sharia-compliant financing won't matter, in our experience. The second 10, well, the bank says, my ratios are better, the principal's down, things still look good, I only need 90% of the proceeds. You sell the next 20, they say, now we're in good shape as a bank. Our collateral value is high, very, very high. So you keep 50%, prepay 50, et cetera. All of that under the understanding to sell will be through those payments will all run through the understanding to sell. It'll get exercised numerous times. Okay, are you going to pay VAT or transfer tax on those? Every one of them? Every time this happens? Probably in most jurisdictions. This you haven't dealt with in your law. These kinds of issues. But at some point, as the market gets more sophisticated on this, you're going to have to. Okay. Sukuk, very briefly. Sukuk are, I'm behind, huh? Not surprised. Are just boxes. To say to me you're going to do a sukuk tells me a little something, but not much. The question is, what's in the box? Is it a lease arrangement? Is it a murabaha? Is it a salam, a wakala arrangement? What is it? That's what makes the difference. Okay, so kind of quickly. Let's say you're going to securitize an ijara. Well, you're going to have, 100 or 1,000 of these structures, all of which will pay through one form or another, either into a trust or another SPV, which are difficult to form here in Turkey, and really difficult to form in most of the world. And then they'll sell the sukuk and make payments to the sukuk holders. A lot of SPVs in the structure. So if you've got 1,000 leases going, 1,000 automobile leases going into a sukuk, you've got 1,000 funding companies, not here, but the rest, 1,000 SPV funding companies, 1,000 SPV project companies, at least one SPV here, so at least 2,000 SPVs. Okay, the true sale issue, which is also unclear here, so I'm told by the local bankruptcy insolvency lawyers. What is a true sale? Well, an asset originator will sell to an issuer of a sukuk, an asset, and it'll get paid out of the proceeds of the issuance of the sukuk. The question in every jurisdiction and for every rating agency is that really a sale, what's called a true sale? And what that means relates to the creditors of the originator. There are other creditor issues that are considered under other doctrines. But under the true sale doctrine, is it really a sale? And the importance is they start to go bankrupt. The creditor comes after them and says, well, wait a second, you didn't really sell that asset, you loaned it, or you let somebody use it, or something. I don't know what it is, but you didn't truly sell it. So I want the asset back into this estate up here. That means these people get nothing. The sukuk holder now is bust. So this is a big issue for rating agencies. They care a lot about this issue. If it's not a true sale, they say that wasn't really a sale and the asset should be up there. And they go grab it and take it away from the sukuk holders. Okay, if it is a true sale, what happens is that's blocked. This is a good sale. The sukuk holders get all the benefit of the asset, and that estate gets none of the benefit. Well, rating agency, this will be that first category of things they look at. And the fact of the matter is, in most jurisdictions around the world, you can't tell. But if you do a transaction in the US or England or France or Germany, you're going to have to get some lawyers to give you a true sale opinion. We give them all the time. But it's an analysis of this whole set of problems. There are a lot of considerations there. Asset-based and asset-backed. You already heard my tirade on this. I don't think it makes much difference. In the Sharia literature, people always talk about it as if it's a huge thing. Asset-backed would be an asset transfer. You actually transfer title to the asset. Well, that may be practical in the beginning of your market, but I don't think it's going to be practical as you go along. Because, well, let's begin with, if a sovereign government wants to do a transaction and they're going to use the treasury building as the asset to back the sukuk, you think they're ever going to transfer title to the treasury building to a Cayman Islands corporation? It's never going to happen. And we go around the whole world. It's never going to happen. I have yet to see a government that would do that. Nobody has ever done that. They aren't going to give their assets, and usually constitutionally in one form or another, they cannot. You can't give away, you can't sell the government assets like that under most jurisdictions' laws, the constitutional provisions. So what do? You grant a security interest in it. Instead of selling it, you lease it to the Cayman Islands company and you lease it back. Beneficial interest. It's a usufruct. That's the civil law issue we talked about before. But a lease is easy. The civil law does recognize leases. So many of these transactions, most of the Ijara transactions in the world are leasebacks of government buildings or other government assets. So you lease it to the Cayman Islands company, you lease it back because we need to put our government treasury folks in the building and operate. So what do? Other jurisdictions, the transfer costs are too high. Most jurisdictions you have to pay, New York City you have to pay a 4% of the gross value as a transfer tax when you transfer a real property interest. Big tax. Well, you bankrupt the deal. I mean, you can't do deals if you got to sell it twice, once to get it over there for the securitization and once to get it back. That's a minimum of 8% transfer tax. Not practical. And that's true on planes, go through the list of power plants, manufacturing facilities, what have you. So nobody does that. What do? You give a first mortgage. There are SPVs involved to tie back that have no other creditors, so the bank gets first lien, or the sukuk holders get a first lien, and they get no competitors that have any other liens. Well, what is that? That's just delaying the transfer of title to a condition in which there's a default. It's a transfer of a beneficial interest for the time being, but not title. So you're back to your mishwak kind of analysis. Or, in many instances, there are provisions, consumer protection laws and things that say if you transfer somebody's obligation, you have to get their consent. Well, let's say you want to do a credit card receivable transaction. You going to get the consent of 10 million credit card holders? Never. So you use security instruments. Okay. So those issues come up repeatedly. Sharia governance. Everybody first thinks of Sharia boards. All right, great. You're going to have it in the bank. You're going to have it at the national level. You're going to have it at the association level. What are they going to do? Do you want harmony, or do you want people to compete? Might depend on whether, what madhab your population comes from. Saudi, it's relatively easy. Everybody's Hanbali, except the Shiites that live in some areas. But most jurisdictions don't do that. They allow the competition. The more of a national board you have, the more standardization. If it's at association level, you begin to standardize. Well, that's good for small ticket transactions. It's a good thing. It's not so great for large commercial transactions where people are being really innovative and competing. It's slowed them down a lot around the world. Malaysia has 2 national Sharia boards, one, for example, in the securities regulator and one in Bank Negara, the central bank. But they don't rule on individual transactions. Every bank must have its own Sharia board. What they do is they set general principles and they approve who can be on the bank boards. And they work on qualification, fitness, who can be a Sharia scholar. What's the authority within the organization? Can you overrule the chief executive officer on Sharia matters? What's the pecking order in terms of power and decision making? How does it all work? Some of that goes into law. Liability of Sharia board members. In the Malaysian law now, you can sue a Sharia scholar on a Sharia board and collect damages. They aren't very happy about that. It was a really interesting development. Governor Dr. Zeti, when she was chair of Bank Negara, tried to get the Sharia scholars to enact a code of professional responsibility, an ethics code. And we looked at, there was a committee, I am on that committee, we looked at a lot of different models from around the world from different industries. Sharia scholars wanted none of it. And we haven't had any scandals. It's not like, but she's a pretty forward-looking person, and I think she's one of the most remarkable people to be alive in the last 40, 50 years. She built a lot of this. She well deserves it. Remarkable woman. They would have none of it, so she put it in the law and said, okay, then we'll sue you. Not a great result for them. I think they would have rather had the ethics code, from what they've told me. There are lots of conflict of interest issues. How many boards can you be on? There's Sharia scholars for good reason, and I'm not disparaging this. There's some benefits and some burdens that are on 30 or 40 different Sharia boards. But those are hard issues. The Sharia scholar issues aren't the only one, though. Sharia risk management. Some of these things you may have thought of in the participation bank, but the system as a whole hasn't addressed. Risk management, control functions, review functions, audit functions. Do you have internal auditors? Do you have external auditors? What are the standards? Look at the Malaysian system or even Oman. The Oman reg is quite good as well. Much simpler, much less developed. It was only enacted a few years ago. Anyway, these are difficult issues. The last thing, the really critical factor is who has the will. Does the government really want it? Do you guys really want it? Do the bankers want it? Do the lawyers want it? Do the accountants want it? Go through all the market participants. If all those people want it, it'll happen. I mentioned municipalities at the beginning. Municipalities have wonderful assets, and they have a lot of them, and often they have no liens on them. They're perfect for Sharia compliant stuff. Municipalities don't issue Sharia, sukuk, or any other instruments. They just don't have the will, and they don't need to do it until somebody on high tells them to do it. So that's one group, and I mentioned the bankers. You have your own interests as bankers. Why should you build competitors? Why should you build a capital market system and get rid of your investment companies and pension management of pension funds, et cetera? There's not a lot of appetite for that. Well, those issues you'll work your way through. Other countries don't begin necessarily with the banks having the position that you have here. You know, it's more diversified to begin with. And then you have to decide what kind of competition you want, where, you know, and the government gets very involved in all that. Okay, if you want the slides, they'll have them. After this is there isn't time, but there's some slides on taxation and movement of particularly single tier and double tier, two-tier Mudarba banking models. The taxation analysis we've done in different places. Questions? Nobody asked any questions for the whole time. Yeah, you. But you're in the front row, so yeah, I knew you would ask a question. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope it's of some interest to you. And I wish you really well with the development of the industry here. It's great progress. The 2016 Tax Act is really remarkably, it's a beautiful thing and indicative of, you know, a country that's willing to move. Some countries we've worked on for years and there's been nothing. You know, what can you do? Okay, thank you.